She thought the unpaid school fee would only cost her son a science fair ribbon, until a black car pulled up and changed his last name in front of the entire school. Tell me where you're listening from, and if you love emotional mafia stories with powerful fathers and public twists, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The call came at 2:17 in the afternoon. Isabella knew the number before she even looked at the screen. The school. Her stomach tightened instantly. Schools rarely called for good reasons in the middle of the day. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered on the second ring. Hello, Mrs. Marino? The voice was warm, careful, professional in that overly gentle way administrators use when something uncomfortable is coming. This is Mrs. Carter from Ridgewood Elementary. Yes, Isabella replied, forcing her tone steady. Is Daniel okay? Oh, he's perfectly fine, Mrs. Carter reassured quickly. He's actually very excited about the science fair this week. Isabella exhaled slowly. Of course he was. Daniel had been talking about it for days. No, weeks. The baking soda volcano had taken over their kitchen counter. Red food coloring stains still marked the edge of the sink. He had insisted on adding extra glitter to the lava, despite her protests that volcanoes did not sparkle. What's this regarding? Isabella asked gently. There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough. We've noticed that the sponsorship fee for Daniel's project hasn't been submitted yet. Isabella's fingers tightened around the phone. The sponsorship fee. She had seen the email. She had read it 3 times. Every student participating in the regional science fair needed a sponsor contribution, a required amount to cover materials, display boards, and registration with the district. $250. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't nothing. I'm aware, Isabella said carefully. I was planning to. The deadline is tomorrow morning, Mrs. Carter interrupted gently. Without the fee, we won't be able to register Daniel's project for display. The words felt heavier than they should have. Won't be able to display. Daniel had been so proud. He had practiced his presentation in the mirror, timed himself explaining chemical reactions. He had even asked her to record him once so he could see if I look like a real scientist. She closed her eyes briefly. I understand, Isabella said. We do have sponsorship options, Mrs. Carter added quickly. Some parents find local businesses willing to sign on, if you're unable to cover the amount personally. Sponsorship. The word echoed differently in her mind. There was only one man she knew who could sign a check without blinking, and she had promised herself she would never ask him for anything. I'll take care of it, Isabella said firmly. Of course, Mrs. Carter replied. Daniel's project is very impressive. We'd hate for him to miss the opportunity. So would I. When the call ended, the house felt too quiet. The volcano sat on the kitchen counter, cardboard base painted carefully with Daniel's name in thick black letters. Daniel Marino. Her chest tightened at the surname. She walked over and ran her fingers along the edge of the display board. He had worked so hard. And it wasn't about the ribbon. It was about standing at that table, explaining something he had built with his own hands. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder notification for rent due next week. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table. She could move money around, delay something else, maybe pick up an extra shift. But the deadline was tomorrow morning. She glanced toward the hallway where Daniel's backpack lay discarded, his shoes kicked off beside it. He would be home in less than an hour. He would ask if she'd found a sponsor yet. He would say it casually, trying not to sound worried. Because even at 8 years old, Daniel understood when money was tight. Her throat burned. She had left his father to give him something normal, predictable, small enough to manage. She would not undo that. Not for a check. Not for pride. And certainly not for an announcement that would ripple through a school hallway faster than gossip. Isabella stood and opened her laptop, searching through local businesses. Maybe the bakery down the street. Maybe the hardware store. She drafted emails carefully, professionally. My son has been selected. We are seeking sponsorship. Any support would be appreciated. Each sentence felt like a negotiation with dignity. Outside, a car engine slowed briefly in front of her house before moving on. She didn't look. She didn't allow herself to think about how easily this problem could disappear with one call. Daniel burst through the door 20 minutes later, breathless and smiling. "Mama! Mrs. Carter said tomorrow's the last day for sponsors. Did you find one?" He said it lightly, but his eyes searched her face. She smiled back. "I'm working on it." He nodded quickly. "It's okay if I don't win," he added. "I just want people to see it." Her heart cracked open. "I know," she whispered. And in that moment, Isabella realized something she had spent years avoiding. This wasn't just about a science fair. It was about whether she would continue carrying everything alone, or risk letting the most powerful man she had ever loved step back into their son's life. The deadline was tomorrow morning, and pride had never felt so expensive. The number was still saved in her phone. She had never deleted it. Isabella told herself that was practical, that emergencies required preparation, that blocking him completely would have been reckless. But she had never pressed call. Not in 3 years. She stood in her kitchen long after Daniel had gone to bed, the house quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. The volcano sat on the counter, glitter catching the light like something hopeful and fragile at the same time. $250. It wasn't impossible. It just wasn't easy. Her phone rested face down on the table. She knew exactly what would happen if she turned it over and scrolled down. Alessandro Romano. The name still felt heavier than it should. He could transfer the money in seconds. He could fund the entire school without blinking. He could sign his name once and erase this problem like it never existed. And that was exactly why she wouldn't call. She had left him for a reason. Not because she didn't love him. That had been the problem. She loved him too much. She loved him enough to imagine their son growing up inside marble walls and iron gates. Enough to picture security teams outside kindergarten classrooms. Enough to see Daniel learning to recognize threats before he learned multiplication tables. She had walked away before Daniel was old enough to remember his father's voice. Before Alessandro could shape him. Before the world Alessandro commanded could touch him. She had promised herself something the day she left. Daniel would have a normal childhood. Not one built on fear disguised as protection. Her phone buzzed with an incoming notification. Not him, just a promotional email. Still, her pulse jumped. She exhaled slowly and flipped the phone over anyway. His name stared back at her from the contact list. Untouched, unchanged. She pressed it once, not to call. Just to look. There were no recent messages. No missed calls. He had respected her silence. Or perhaps he had simply waited. The memory of his voice came back to her. Calm, measured, always 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. If she called, he wouldn't ask questions. He would ask where to send the money. And then he would ask why she hadn't called sooner. And that conversation would lead to something else. Acknowledgement. Visibility. A door she had fought hard to keep closed. Daniel deserved better than to become leverage in someone else's negotiation. She locked the phone and pushed it away. Pride wasn't the right word. It wasn't about ego. It was about boundaries. If she called him now, for a sponsorship fee, what would the next call be for? Medical bills, school tuition. Every small crack would widen, and soon Daniel's life wouldn't be separate from Alessandro's world. It would be absorbed into it. She walked into Daniel's room quietly. He was sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging off the side, his science fair notes scattered on the desk. A drawing taped above his bed read, "Future Inventor." Her chest tightened. He believed in effort, in work, in earning things, not in problems being erased by power. She sat on the edge of his bed and brushed his hair back gently. "I'll figure it out," she whispered. She always did. The next morning she arrived at the school early, determination steady in her chest. She had emailed 5 local businesses. One had replied asking for more information. Another had politely declined. It wasn't over. Mrs. Carter greeted her in the hallway. "Were you able to secure a sponsor?" she asked carefully. I'm working on it, Isabella replied with a small, controlled smile. The truth hovered unspoken. Working on it meant refusing the easiest solution, because the easiest solution came with consequences. When she stepped back outside into the cool morning air, she paused for a moment, looking at the school building. Brick walls, children's laughter. Ordinary. Safe. This was the life she chose for Daniel. Not private security briefings, not whispered names in dark rooms. If she called Alessandro, she would be inviting all of that back in. She slid into her car and closed the door firmly. No, she would find another way. She had survived alone for 3 years. She would not break that line for a check, even if it meant swallowing pride somewhere else, even if it meant working twice as hard, even if it meant watching Daniel pretend not to care. She started the engine, and left his father's name exactly where it had been, untouched. The volcano had taken over their kitchen, not dramatically, not destructively, just steadily. As if Daniel's excitement had expanded to fill every available surface. Cardboard, glue sticks, crumpled newspaper, baking soda, food coloring, printed research pages with highlighted sentences far too advanced for an 8-year-old to fully understand, but recited anyway with complete confidence. Daniel stood on a chair at the counter, paintbrush in hand, tongue peeking out in concentration as he layered brown and gray paint onto the papier-mâché cone. It has to look realistic, he explained for the 5th time that week. Isabella leaned against the doorway, watching him with a mixture of pride and ache. What makes it realistic? She asked gently. It can't be too smooth, he replied seriously. Volcanoes are messy. They're powerful. Powerful, the word lingered. He didn't understand budgets. He didn't understand registration deadlines or sponsorship forms. He understood reaction, cause and effect. Baking soda plus vinegar equals eruption. Simple, hopeful, controlled. Do you think the judges will like it? He asked suddenly, glancing at her over his shoulder. I think they'll love it, she answered without hesitation. Because they would. He had worked for weeks. After school, he didn't ask for cartoons. He asked for research time. He practiced his presentation in front of the mirror in the hallway, adjusting his posture like he'd seen in documentaries. Good afternoon, he would begin formally. Today I will demonstrate a chemical reaction using common household materials. He had timed himself. 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Too long? He had asked. Perfect, she told him. He had even saved part of his allowance to buy extra red glitter for the lava. Science can be fun, he insisted when she questioned it. He didn't understand that the fee attached to participation wasn't about science. It was about structure, about systems, about money. To him, the project was already complete the moment the volcano first erupted across their kitchen counter, red foam spilling dramatically over the edges as he shouted, It's alive! She remembered the way his laughter filled the room that day. Pure, unfiltered. He hadn't seen her step back instinctively when the foam spread too far, her heart jumping not because of mess, but because she was always bracing for something. Daniel didn't brace. He leapt. Can we test it again? He asked now, carefully placing the finished volcano onto its cardboard base, labeled in bold letters. Daniel Marino. Grade 3. Chemical reactions. She swallowed at the last name. Yes, she said softly. He measured the baking soda precisely, then paused. You think it'll be bigger at school? He asked. Why? Because everyone will be watching. Her heart squeezed. Yes, she said gently. I think it'll be bigger. He smiled at that, satisfied. He didn't ask about the sponsorship again. Not that evening. Not while carefully packing the supplies into a small plastic container. Not while rehearsing his introduction one more time before bed. But she saw it in the way he hesitated before turning off the light. In the way he glanced at the volcano display sitting proudly on his desk. He believed in it. In himself. In effort. He didn't understand that adults sometimes had to negotiate for space at tables. He believed if you built something good enough, the world would let you show it. Later, After he fell asleep, Isabella walked quietly into his room. The volcano stood near the window, moonlight catching the glitter in the paint. It looked grand. Important. Too important to be quietly removed from a list because of a fee. She traced her fingers lightly over the cardboard edge. Daniel didn't understand budgets. He didn't understand leverage. He didn't understand that a single check could solve everything and complicate everything at the same time. He understood effort. He understood hope. And right now, hope sat drying in layers of paint and glue on his desk. She closed her eyes for a moment. If he couldn't present it, he would say it was okay. He would shrug. He would say maybe next year. But something inside him would dim. Just slightly. And she had worked too hard to keep that light alive. The volcano wasn't just a project. It was his first moment of standing in front of a room and saying, "Look what I built." It was proof that he belonged in spaces that celebrated curiosity. It meant everything to him. And because it meant everything to him, it meant everything to her. She stood there in the quiet, listening to his steady breathing. He didn't understand budgets. Only excitement. Only hope. And tomorrow morning, hope would either stand proudly on a display table or be quietly boxed back up. She wasn't sure which outcome scared her more. The disappointment, or the call she still hadn't made. The email came first. Polite, structured, official. Isabella read it twice before the words fully settled. Final reminder. Science fair sponsorship deadline. 24 hours remaining. She stared at the screen, her coffee untouched beside her laptop. 24 hours. Not a suggestion. Not a flexible window. A line. She had managed to secure 2 small pledges from local businesses. $25 from the bakery, $50 from the hardware store. Kind gestures. Generous within their limits. But not enough. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an email. "Mrs. Marino?" The principal's voice carried through the line with measured warmth. "I wanted to follow up personally." Isabella straightened automatically, as if the woman could see her posture through the call. "Yes." "Daniel's project is exceptional," the principal continued. "His teacher speaks very highly of his preparation." Isabella swallowed. "Thank you. But as you know, district registration requires full sponsorship documentation. Without it, we can't include his name on the participant list." The word list felt sterile, administrative, but Isabella knew what it meant. His name would be erased quietly from the board posted outside the auditorium. His display space reassigned. His hard work reduced to a project seen only in their kitchen. "We've extended the deadline as far as policy allows," the principal added gently. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., the final roster will be submitted." 10 a.m. Less than 24 hours now. "I understand," Isabella said carefully. There was a pause. "Mrs. Marino, if there are circumstances you'd like to discuss privately, we're open to—" "No," Isabella interrupted softly. "I'll handle it." The principal didn't push further. "Very well. We'll wait to hear from you." When the call ended, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. 24 hours. She looked around her small apartment, the neat stack of Daniel's research papers on the coffee table, the carefully painted volcano resting near the window to dry completely. Daniel had left for school that morning humming under his breath, confident. "I can't wait to show them," he had said at breakfast. She hadn't told him about the final deadline. Not yet. She opened her banking app again. Numbers shifted around the screen, unhelpful and immovable. She could borrow, ask a friend. But borrowing meant explaining. Explaining meant admitting she couldn't cover something as basic as a school fee. Her chest tightened. Her phone rested beside her laptop. She didn't need to scroll to see his name. It was etched into her mind. Alessandro. He wouldn't hesitate. He wouldn't ask for details. He would simply solve it. And that solution would ripple far beyond a science fair. At 3:30 that afternoon, Daniel burst through the door again, backpack swinging. "Mama, they put up the participant list in the hallway. My name's still there." For now, she thought. "That's great," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. It's next to Jacob's robot project, he added excitedly. We're both in the front section. Front section. Visible. He dropped his backpack and ran to check the volcano one more time. Do you think I should practice louder? He called from the hallway. So people in the back can hear me? Her throat tightened painfully. Yes, she answered softly. He didn't see the way her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter. Later that evening, she drove back to the school under the pretense of dropping off a forgotten notebook. She needed to see it herself. The hallway was empty now, lights dimmed but not off. The participant list hung neatly in a clear plastic sleeve outside the auditorium. She stepped closer. Daniel Marino. Chemical reactions. The power of volcanoes. Her fingers hovered over his name. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., if the sponsorship wasn't complete, it would be removed. No announcement. No explanation to the other children. Just absence. She imagined Daniel walking down this hallway, scanning the list, not finding his name. She imagined the pause, the confusion, the quiet question in his eyes. Why? She stepped back slowly. 24 hours. The line was clear. This wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't even about money. It was about whether she would let systems quietly erase her son's effort, or whether she would break the one boundary she had sworn never to cross. As she walked back toward her car, the evening air felt sharper. The deadline wasn't just administrative, it was personal. 10 a.m. And time, for the first time in years, felt like an enemy she couldn't outmaneuver alone. The next morning felt heavier than it should have. Isabella barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the participant list in the hallway. Daniel's name balanced on borrowed time. 10 a.m. She checked the clock again as she helped Daniel button his shirt. You're coming early today, right? He asked, adjusting the crooked collar himself before she could fix it. Of course, she said softly. He grinned, satisfied, and grabbed the carefully boxed volcano project from the kitchen table. Don't tilt it, she warned automatically. I won't, he promised, holding it like something sacred. The drive to school was quiet. Daniel rehearsed under his breath in the back seat, occasionally pausing to ask, Do you think I should smile more? Or, what if someone asks a question I don't know? You'll figure it out, she told him, because he always did. When they turned onto the school street, she noticed it immediately. A sleek black car parked directly at the curb near the main entrance. Not a common sedan. Not a family SUV. Low, polished, deliberate. The kind of vehicle that didn't blend into elementary school drop-off lines. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Daniel didn't notice. He was too busy making sure the box didn't shift. But Isabella saw the way a few parents slowed their steps. The way conversations softened mid-sentence. Whispers travel faster in quiet places. She pulled into a parking spot across the street. The black car's engine wasn't running. It didn't need to. It sat there with quiet authority, reflecting the morning sun in dark, unreadable windows. Two men stood near it, not in uniform, not aggressive, just composed. Observing without appearing to. Security. Her pulse stuttered. She hadn't called him. She was certain of that. She had stared at his number again last night. She had locked her phone. She had told herself she would handle it. Come on, Mama, Daniel called from the sidewalk, already halfway to the entrance. She forced her legs to move. The closer she walked, the more obvious it became. The atmosphere had shifted. Parents lingered near the entrance longer than usual. A teacher stood by the door, posture slightly straighter than normal. The black car door opened smoothly, and time seemed to slow. Alessandro Romano stepped out like he had stepped into every room she had ever known him in, controlled, measured, aware of every pair of eyes without acknowledging them directly. He wore a tailored dark coat, simple but unmistakably expensive. No tie, no visible security headset. Just presence. Daniel stopped mid-step. Mama, he whispered, tugging at her sleeve. Is that? Yes, she said quietly. Alessandro's gaze found them immediately. It always did. Not possessive. Not surprised. Intentional. He didn't rush forward. He walked at an even pace, greeting the principal first with a polite nod, then turning toward Isabella and Daniel. "Good morning," he said calmly. His voice carried just enough to reach curious ears without becoming spectacle. "What are you doing here?" Isabella asked under her breath. He glanced at Daniel first. "Science fair," he replied simply. Daniel's eyes flickered between them. "You came to see my volcano?" he asked cautiously. "If I'm allowed," Alessandro answered. The simplicity disarmed even her. Behind them, whispers thickened. "That's him." "Isn't that—" "Why is he here?" Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. The principal stepped forward quickly, composed but visibly aware of the ripple moving through the crowd. "Mr. Romano," she greeted carefully. "Good morning," he replied. "I believe there's a registration matter to finalize." Isabella's breath caught. He knew. Of course he knew. Alessandro didn't look at her when he continued. "I prefer to handle these things in person." The black car remained at the curb, quiet but commanding. Parents watched openly now, not hostile, not welcoming. Curious. The security presence, subtle but undeniable, shifted the morning from routine to something charged. Daniel adjusted his grip on the volcano box. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly. Isabella knelt to his level. "Yes," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Everything's okay." Alessandro's eyes softened almost imperceptibly at the sight of them. He stepped slightly aside, gesturing toward the entrance. "After you," he said. Not an order, an invitation. The hallway inside buzzed with early activity, children carrying projects, teachers organizing tables. But as Alessandro walked in beside them, the energy changed. Conversations paused. Glances lingered. The sleek black car outside was only the beginning. This wasn't anonymous help. This wasn't quiet assistance. This was deliberate. And Isabella understood something with absolute clarity as she followed him toward the school office. The deadline hadn't just been met. It had been answered. Publicly. Isabella didn't have to explain anything. That was the first thing she understood when Alessandro stepped fully into the school office. He didn't look confused. He didn't look surprised. He looked informed. Mrs. Carter stood behind the reception desk, posture professional but visibly alert. The principal lingered near the doorway, hands clasped carefully in front of her. Alessandro removed his gloves slowly, placing them on the desk with deliberate calm. "Good morning," he said evenly. "Mr. Romano," the principal replied. "This is unexpected." "I prefer to address matters directly," he answered. He didn't glance at Isabella for confirmation. He didn't ask what the amount was. He didn't request details about policy or deadlines. He already knew. Isabella felt it in the air between them. "How did you—" she started quietly. He turned his head slightly toward her. "There are registration records," he said simply. "District filings, sponsorship submissions." Her chest tightened. Of course there were. He operated in a world where information wasn't stumbled upon. It was gathered. "Daniel's name appeared on the preliminary roster," he continued calmly, "without finalized sponsorship documentation." Mrs. Carter shifted uncomfortably. "We have standard procedures. And I respect that," Alessandro interrupted gently. "Which is why I'm here. Not to intimidate, to conclude." Daniel stood beside Isabella, clutching his volcano box, wide-eyed but silent. He sensed the gravity without understanding the mechanics. Alessandro's gaze softened slightly when it landed on him. "You worked hard on it?" he asked. Daniel nodded. 3 weeks. "That's impressive." The simple acknowledgement steadied the boy. Isabella watched carefully for arrogance, for dominance. She found none, just clarity. "I would like to finalize the sponsorship," Alessandro said, turning back to the principal. "There are forms," Mrs. Carter replied quickly, pulling a folder from a drawer. "The required amount is—" I'm aware of the amount. Her breath hitched again. He truly did know everything. He took the pen offered to him without hesitation. The room felt smaller. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't. He signed where indicated with controlled precision. Mrs. Carter glanced at the check when he slid it across the desk. Her eyes widened before she could mask the reaction. Mr. Romano, this is considerably more than the required fee. Yes, the principal cleared her throat. This would fund the entire grade's science program for the semester. That's acceptable. Isabella stared at him. You didn't have to. I know, he replied softly. The distinction lingered. He didn't have to. He chose to. Mrs. Carter looked between them carefully. Would you prefer the donation remain anonymous? The question hung in the air like a test. Isabella's pulse quickened. This was the moment. He could erase himself from it. He could solve the problem quietly and disappear. Alessandro didn't hesitate. No. The single word shifted the atmosphere again. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, adjusting the paperwork. In that case, we'll register the sponsorship under your full name. Correct. Daniel looked up at Isabella. Why would he want his name on it? She swallowed. Alessandro answered instead. Because you shouldn't have to stand alone. The simplicity of the statement silenced the room. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was intentional. Mrs. Carter processed the forms quickly now, hands moving with renewed efficiency. Daniel's project will remain on the roster, she confirmed. Good, Alessandro said calmly. Isabella stepped closer to him once the paperwork was complete. You could have called, she said under her breath. I could have, he agreed. You didn't. I wanted you to see that I already knew. Her throat tightened. You were watching. I was aware. The correction mattered. Watching implied surveillance. Awareness implied responsibility. I won't let administrative deadlines decide whether my son's work is displayed, he said quietly. The word landed heavily. My son. Not whispered, not hidden. Stated. The principal offered a careful smile. We appreciate the generosity, Mr. Romano. Alessandro inclined his head slightly. This isn't generosity, he replied. It's investment. Daniel blinked. In volcanoes? A faint smile touched Alessandro's mouth. In potential. The tension eased just slightly. As they stepped back into the hallway, whispers followed them. Parents who had arrived late now recognized him openly. The sleek black car outside wasn't rumor anymore. It was confirmation. Isabella felt the shift like a ripple through the building. This wasn't anonymous charity. This was deliberate acknowledgement. He hadn't asked questions because he didn't need to. He hadn't waited to be invited because the deadline had already spoken. He already knew. And now so did everyone else. The school office had never felt so small. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A corkboard near the door displayed colorful flyers about bake sales and field trips. A faint scent of printer ink lingered in the air. Ordinary, that was what made the contrast sharper. Alessandro Romano stood at the edge of the receptionist's desk as if he belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than an elementary school office. Not imposing. Not loud. Just composed. Mrs. Carter slid the sponsorship form toward him with careful hands. The required contribution is $250, she said, voice steady but cautious. That covers registration, display materials, and district fees. Alessandro glanced at the document without leaning in too far. I'm aware, he replied. Isabella stood beside Daniel, her heart pounding in her ears. She had imagined a quick payment, a simple resolution. What she hadn't imagined was this calm certainty. He pulled a checkbook from the inside pocket of his coat. Not rushed, not hesitant. He wrote deliberately, pen moving with smooth precision across the paper. Mrs. Carter waited. The principal watched. Isabella tried to read his expression and found nothing reactive there. No annoyance, no performative generosity. When he finished, he tore the check free and placed it on the desk, Mrs. Carter's eyes dropped to the number and widened. "Mr. Romano," she began carefully, "this amount is—" "Correct," he interrupted gently. The principal stepped closer, reading over her shoulder. "This would fund not just Daniel's registration," she said quietly. "It would cover the entire third-grade science program. Materials, lab kits, even next semester's enrichment activities." "Yes." Daniel blinked up at them. "Does that mean everyone gets to do experiments?" he asked. Alessandro's gaze shifted to him. "Yes." "Even the kids who didn't have sponsors?" "Yes." Daniel grinned as if this were the most natural outcome in the world. Isabella felt her throat tighten. "You didn't have to do that," she said under her breath. "I know," Alessandro replied calmly. The difference between have to and choose to settled heavily between them. Mrs. Carter cleared her throat, regaining composure. "We're very grateful, Mr. Romano. If you'd like, we can list the donation under a foundation name. Many contributors prefer discretion." There it was again. The easy exit. Anonymity. Alessandro didn't hesitate. "Listed under my full name." The principal exchanged a brief glance with Mrs. Carter. "Of course," she said. The pen moved quickly as they adjusted the paperwork. Daniel shifted the volcano box in his hands, looking between the adults. "Does this mean I can still present?" he asked quietly. Alessandro stepped closer to him, lowering his voice just slightly. "Yes," he said. "You'll present." Daniel's shoulders straightened instinctively, pride replacing uncertainty. "Good," he said with simple relief. The principal extended her hand. "We truly appreciate this support. Our science program has been limited recently." Alessandro shook her hand once, firm and respectful. "Curiosity should never be limited," he replied evenly. Isabella watched him carefully. There was no showmanship in his posture, no lingering gaze toward the hallway where whispers had begun to ripple. He wasn't here to intimidate. He wasn't here to impress. He was here to solve something decisively. Mrs. Carter printed an official receipt and slid it across the desk. "We'll make an announcement before the fair begins," she said. "It's important families understand where the funding came from." Isabella felt her pulse spike. An announcement. Alessandro met her eyes briefly. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask permission. He simply held her gaze long enough for her to understand something unspoken. Hidden help invites speculation. Visible help ends it. Daniel tugged lightly at Isabella's sleeve. "Mama, can we go set up now?" "Yes," she managed softly. As they stepped back into the hallway, the atmosphere had shifted again. Word traveled fast in contained spaces. Parents who had been dropping off projects now lingered, pretending not to stare. Teachers stood a little straighter. The sleek black car outside remained parked at the curb, not blocking anything, just present. Daniel walked ahead of them this time, carrying his volcano with renewed confidence. He didn't look smaller. He didn't look overshadowed. He looked proud. Alessandro fell into step beside Isabella. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have had to find out," she replied. He nodded once. "Daniel's work deserved to be seen," he said. "Money shouldn't decide that." She studied him for a moment. "You didn't just pay the fee." "No. You made a statement. Yes." Not aggressive. Not threatening. Definitive. Inside the auditorium, tables were being arranged in neat rows. Daniel carefully placed his volcano at the front section, exactly where his name had been listed. Isabella watched as he adjusted the display board proudly. Alessandro stood a few steps back, hands loosely clasped behind him. The signed check sat processed in the office now, registered, filed, attached to a name that carried weight far beyond a school hallway. This wasn't charity, it was declaration. And as Daniel looked up at them both, smiling with unfiltered excitement, Isabella realized the check had done more than fund a science program. It had drawn a line, not in money, in acknowledgement. And once again, Alessandro had chosen visibility over silence. The announcement was scheduled for 9:45 a.m., 10 minutes before the science fair officially opened to parents and judges. Isabella stood near Daniel's table, adjusting the edge of the display board, even though it didn't need adjusting. Her hands needed something to do. Daniel was rehearsing again under his breath, eyes locked on his cue cards. Across the auditorium, teachers moved between tables, checking placements. Parents filtered in slowly, murmuring politely to one another. At the front of the room, the principal tapped the microphone. The soft feedback hum drew everyone's attention. "Good morning, everyone," she began warmly. "Before we begin our presentations, I'd like to acknowledge a generous contribution that has made today's event possible." Isabella felt her pulse spike. Daniel looked up, curious but unaware. The principal continued, voice steady but measured. "Due to recent budget limitations, our science program has faced challenges in providing adequate materials and registration support. This morning, we received a donation that fully funds not only today's participation requirements, but our third-grade science enrichment for the semester." A ripple moved through the crowd. Parents exchanged surprised glances. Teachers straightened visibly. "This donation has been registered under the full name of its contributor," the principal said carefully, "Mr. Alessandro Romano." The room went still, not loudly, but perceptibly. Isabella felt the shift like a pressure change in the air. Alessandro stood near the side of the auditorium, hands folded loosely in front of him. No spotlight, no dramatic movement, just presence. Whispers began almost immediately. "That Romano? As in, isn't he—" Eyes turned, curiosity sharpened. Recognition clicked into place for those who followed business headlines, for those who understood the weight attached to that surname. The principal's voice continued smoothly, as if this were any other donation. "We are deeply grateful for his support and commitment to fostering curiosity and innovation among our students." Applause began, polite at first, then stronger. Because regardless of reputation, funding a school program earned gratitude. Daniel blinked, confused. "That's him," he whispered to Isabella, pointing subtly toward Alessandro. "Yes," she said quietly. "He used his whole name?" "Yes." Daniel considered that for a moment, then looked back at his volcano. "Cool," he said simply. Children didn't process power the way adults did. They processed action, and the action was simple. The science fair was happening. But the adults understood more. A teacher approached Alessandro carefully after the applause ended. "Mr. Romano," she said, voice respectful but cautious, "we appreciate your generosity." He inclined his head once. "Curiosity deserves opportunity," he replied evenly. The phrasing spread quickly. Within minutes, Isabella could feel the difference. The way parents glanced at Daniel, then at Alessandro. The way whispers carried just a little longer than necessary. It wasn't scandal. It was realization. Daniel Marino. Romano. Connections forming in real time. Mrs. Carter approached Isabella quietly. "I hope you're comfortable with the public acknowledgement," she said gently. He was very clear about it. "I noticed," Isabella replied. He declined anonymity immediately. Of course he did. Because anonymous help could be interpreted as quiet charity. Public help was something else entirely. It was alignment, ownership, protection. Across the room, Alessandro walked toward Daniel's table. He didn't take center stage. He didn't dominate space. He stood slightly behind Daniel as the first judge approached. "Good morning," the judge greeted warmly. "Tell me about your project." Daniel launched into his presentation without hesitation. "Today I will demonstrate a chemical reaction using baking soda and vinegar." His voice carried clearly, confident, unshaken. Alessandro watched without interrupting, without correcting, without overshadowing, just present. Isabella noticed something subtle but important. The way other parents' postures shifted. Not fearful, respectful. Distance formed, not exclusion, but awareness. No one whispered near Daniel's table now. No one questioned his place in the front section. Visibility had changed the dynamic. Mrs. Carter returned to Isabella's side. "I had no idea," she admitted softly, "that Daniel was—" She didn't finish the sentence. "He's my son," Isabella said simply. And it was true. But now, so was the rest. Alessandro hadn't refused anonymity to impress. He had refused it to clarify. Hidden children invite speculation. Acknowledged children carry weight. As Daniel completed his demonstration and the volcano erupted in bright red foam across the tray, applause broke out around the table. He beamed, proud, unaware that the ground beneath him had shifted permanently. Alessandro stepped forward just enough to steady the display board when it wobbled slightly. A small gesture, protective, intentional. When Daniel finished, he looked up at him. "Did I do good?" "You did," Alessandro said calmly. "You prepared." The approval landed deeper than applause. Isabella watched the scene unfold with a strange mixture of fear and clarity. The donation wasn't just financial, it was declarative. The school administration now knew exactly who Daniel's father was. The parents did too, and as whispers faded into cautious respect, Isabella understood the strategy beneath it all. An anonymous check would have solved the problem quietly. A signed one had solved something larger. Daniel was no longer a boy whose project might quietly disappear from a list. He was acknowledged, connected, protected. And in Alessandro's world, being visible wasn't vulnerability. It was armor. Visiting hours began at noon. By then, the auditorium was alive with movement, parents weaving between rows of tables, teachers guiding judges from one project to the next, children standing a little straighter beside their displays. Daniel had already presented twice. Each time, his voice grew steadier, more confident. Isabella stood a few steps back, letting him shine without hovering. She had expected tension to linger after the announcement that morning, expected eyes to follow them too closely. But something else had settled instead. Acceptance. Curiosity had softened into normalcy faster than she thought possible. And then the doors at the back of the auditorium opened. No convoy, no visible security detail crowding the entrance. Just Alessandro. He stepped inside alone. Dark coat removed now, sleeves of his shirt rolled back slightly. No dramatic pause. No scanning of the room like a commander surveying territory. He simply entered like any other parent arriving during lunch break. The shift in atmosphere was subtle but undeniable. Conversations dipped briefly. A few heads turned. But there was no intimidation in his posture. No assertion of space. He moved through the rows calmly, stopping occasionally to glance at other projects, reading posters, nodding politely when children explained their work. Isabella watched carefully. He wasn't performing interest. He was genuinely listening. Daniel noticed him a moment later. His face lit up. "He came back," he whispered. "Yes," she replied softly. Alessandro reached their table and stopped at a respectful distance. "Am I interrupting?" he asked. Daniel shook his head quickly. "No. I was about to show the eruption again." Alessandro glanced at Isabella briefly, a silent question. She gave the smallest nod. Daniel began again, more animated now. "This is baking soda," he explained confidently. "And when you mix it with vinegar, it makes carbon dioxide gas, which creates pressure." Alessandro listened without correcting, without stepping in. Hands loosely clasped behind his back. Attentive. A teacher nearby observed quietly. So did several parents. But the moment wasn't spectacle. It was simple. A father attending his son's presentation. When the red foam spilled over the volcano again, Daniel laughed, triumphant. A few children from nearby tables clapped. Alessandro's mouth curved slightly. "Well executed," he said evenly. Daniel beamed. "Do you want to try it?" he asked impulsively. A flicker of surprise crossed Alessandro's face, not because he didn't want to, because he understood what the invitation meant. "Yes," he replied after a beat. Daniel carefully handed him the small measuring cup. The room stilled slightly again. Curious. Alessandro poured the vinegar steadily into the crater. The reaction erupted immediately, red foam spilling in dramatic waves. Daniel laughed loudly. "So cool," he declared. Alessandro handed the cup back without ceremony. "Controlled reactions are impressive," he said calmly. Daniel nodded seriously. "You have to measure it right." "I know." The double meaning hung there quietly. Isabella felt her chest tighten, not with fear, with something steadier. This wasn't a man claiming space. This was a man choosing presence. A judge approached their table again. "Good afternoon," she greeted. "You must be very proud." Alessandro didn't hesitate. "I am." Two simple words, no elaboration, no disclaimers. Just truth. Daniel stood a little taller. Around them, the whispers that had filled the hallway earlier that morning had softened completely. Parents no longer stared. They nodded politely. Teachers spoke to Alessandro as they would to any other involved parent. Visibility had done what secrecy never could. It normalized. As the afternoon wore on, Alessandro moved away briefly to observe other projects. He didn't linger. He didn't dominate Daniel's space. But he remained within view, within reach. Security, if present at all, was invisible. The sleek, black car remained parked outside, but it felt less like an intrusion, and more like background now. At the end of visiting hours, Daniel ran toward Isabella, breathless. "I did it 3 times, he exclaimed. "And I didn't mess up once." "I saw," she smiled. Alessandro stepped closer. "You handled questions well," he added. Daniel nodded proudly. "I practiced." "I can tell." The validation landed deeper than applause ever could. As families began packing up for the day, Isabella realized something quietly profound. Alessandro hadn't turned the science fair into a spectacle. He hadn't drawn attention to himself. He hadn't needed to. He had simply shown up. Not as a figure from headlines. Not as a rumor in a hallway, but as a father. Present. And in that simple act, the balance shifted. Daniel didn't look overshadowed. He looked supported. And for the first time since the black car had parked at the curb that morning, Isabella felt something settle inside her. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about money. It was about presence. And sometimes presence was the most powerful statement of all. The hallway felt narrower after lunch. Not physically, socially. Clusters of parents lingered near the water fountain and the trophy case, voices lowered just enough to signal discretion. Not silence. Isabella recognized the tone immediately, curiosity wrapped in politeness. "That's him." "I've seen his name in the financial section." "Isn't he connected to—" The rest of the sentence always dissolved into a murmur. Alessandro walked beside Daniel as if he didn't hear any of it, which meant he absolutely did. He didn't quicken his pace. He didn't glare. He didn't acknowledge the glances trailing them. He simply matched Daniel's stride, measured, unbothered. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed taller. Not in arrogance, in certainty. He carried his volcano display tucked carefully under one arm, chin slightly lifted, as a few classmates glanced between him and Alessandro. "Is that your dad?" one boy whispered bluntly. Daniel hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yeah." The word landed clean. No apology, no explanation. The boy blinked, processing. "Cool," he said simply. Children adjusted faster than adults. They didn't weigh reputations. They measured reactions. Alessandro paused briefly near the classroom door as Daniel's teacher approached. "Mr. Romano," she greeted, posture a little straighter than necessary. "Thank you again for your support today." "You're welcome," he replied evenly. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel. "He's very articulate. You must be proud." "I am," Alessandro said again, without embellishment. The teacher smiled tightly. "We're fortunate to have such involved parents." The slight hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Isabella felt it too. Careful wording, measured politeness. Respect layered with caution. Alessandro inclined his head slightly. Children benefit from stability, he said calmly. That's all this is. The teacher nodded, perhaps reassured by the simplicity of the statement. As they continued down the hall, a group of mothers shifted subtly to create space. Not out of fear, out of awareness, the kind that follows power into ordinary rooms. Isabella walked just half a step behind them, observing the shift in real time. Whispers didn't feel hostile. They felt recalibrated. Alessandro's reputation carried weight, yes, but today it had been attached to a donation, to a science program, to a child's volcano experiment. Narratives adjust when evidence changes. Daniel stopped near the bulletin board where ribbons were displayed from past competitions. "Do you think I'll win?" he asked quietly. Alessandro crouched slightly to meet his eye level. "Winning isn't the only measure," he replied. Daniel frowned. "But it's a good one." A faint smile touched Alessandro's mouth. "Yes, it is." "Did you win stuff when you were little?" Daniel asked. Isabella held her breath at the question. Alessandro paused, not because he didn't know the answer, because he was choosing it carefully. "I learned different things," he said finally. Daniel accepted that without pressing. Children rarely interrogated mysteries they couldn't yet frame. Another parent approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mr. Romano?" Alessandro straightened slowly. "Yes? I just wanted to say the science program really needed that funding." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, from navigating unfamiliar proximity to power. "I'm glad it was useful," he replied simply. She nodded quickly and stepped back, clearly relieved by the lack of intimidation. Isabella watched it all unfold with quiet clarity. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had evolved. Less suspicion, more acknowledgement. Visibility had removed the shadow. As they neared the exit, Daniel reached for Alessandro's hand without thinking. The gesture was small, instinctive. Alessandro didn't hesitate. He let him. The hallway quieted again, not dramatically, but noticeably. Daniel didn't shrink under the attention. He stood straighter, shoulders back, volcano held proudly. As if walking beside his father didn't overshadow him. It reinforced him. Outside, the sleek black car waited again. Less spectacle now, more fixture. Isabella paused near the doors, watching Daniel chatter animatedly about carbon dioxide bubbles and reaction speed. Alessandro listened without interruption, present, grounded, not performing dominance, demonstrating steadiness. Whispers might continue. Reputations might linger in quiet conversations. Teachers might tread carefully for a while, but Daniel wasn't bending under it. He was growing into it. And as Isabella stepped out into the afternoon light beside them, she understood something important. Power doesn't always silence rooms. Sometimes it steadies them. And Daniel, walking confidently between them, didn't look intimidated by the weight of a famous surname. He looked taller, as if knowing someone powerful stood beside him had expanded his posture instead of shrinking it. The whispers would fade, the science fair would end, but the image would remain. A boy with glitter-stained hands, a volcano under his arm, and a father walking beside him, not as rumor, not as shadow, but as presence. They didn't speak until they were back in the car. Daniel sat in the back seat, still talking about judges and glitter lava, and how one of the older kids' robots had accidentally rolled into a table leg. His excitement filled the space easily, innocently. Alessandro listened, responding when appropriate, asking a quiet question here and there. Present. But Isabella felt the weight building in her chest. When they pulled up outside her apartment building, Daniel unbuckled quickly. "Can we celebrate with pizza?" he asked. "Yes," Isabella said automatically. Alessandro glanced at her for confirmation. She nodded once. "Go upstairs and wash your hands," she told Daniel gently. "We'll bring it up." Daniel grabbed the volcano box and ran toward the entrance, glancing back only once. "Don't take too long," he called. The door closed behind him. Silence settled. The black car idled quietly. Isabella turned toward Alessandro fully. "You didn't give me a choice," she said. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. He met her gaze steadily. "Yes, I did." "No, you didn't," she replied. "You refused anonymity. You made an announcement. You put your full name on it." "I did. And now everyone knows." "Yes." The calm in his tone only sharpened her frustration. "You exposed him," she said quietly. Alessandro's jaw shifted slightly. "I acknowledged him." "That's not the same." "It is." She shook her head. "You don't understand what it's like in those hallways, the whispers, the way people look at him now." "I do understand," he replied evenly. "Do you?" she pressed. "Because I worked very hard to give him something normal." "And what happened this week?" he asked calmly. The question caught her mid-breath. "What?" "You worked hard," he continued. "You built normal. You protected him. And a $250 deadline nearly erased his work." Her throat tightened. "That's not the same as danger." "It is," he said quietly. "It's a different kind." She looked away briefly, watching a couple walk past on the sidewalk, unaware of the conversation unfolding in the car. "I was protecting him from your world," she said. "And in doing so, you kept him hidden from it." "Yes." He didn't argue. He simply let the word settle. "Hidden children are vulnerable," he said after a moment. She looked back at him sharply. "Explain that." "When no one knows who a child belongs to," he continued evenly, "they are easy to isolate, easy to pressure, easy to remove from conversations." "This isn't a criminal negotiation," she snapped. "No," he agreed. "It's social structure." She frowned. "Power doesn't disappear when you ignore it," he said. "It just moves around you." "And your solution is to make him visible?" she asked. "My solution is to make him acknowledged." The distinction again. "Hidden invites speculation," he continued. "Speculation invites testing." Her pulse flickered at the word. "Today, no one tested him," he said. "No one questioned whether his project belonged in that front section. No one removed his name quietly from a list." "Because of you." "Yes," he said as if she had spoken aloud. She swallowed. "You think attaching your name to him makes him untouchable." "It makes him defended." She crossed her arms. "And what if that defense attracts something worse?" "It won't," he replied calmly. "You can't guarantee that." "I can." The certainty in his voice was unnerving. "Why?" she demanded. "Because the kind of men who might test boundaries understand cost," he said, and today the cost became clear. This wasn't about school gossip. It was about broader perception, visibility as deterrence. "I didn't want him to grow up under shadow," she whispered. "And he isn't," Alessandro replied. "He's standing in light." She stared at him. Light creates attention. Attention creates protection. Silence stretched between them. She thought of Daniel walking down that hallway, chin lifted, answering a classmate without hesitation. Yeah, she thought of the teacher's cautious respect, of the principal's tone, of the way the whispers had softened into something less threatening. "He stood taller," Alessandro said quietly. She hated that he was right. "He wasn't shrinking," he continued. "He wasn't apologizing for his name. He wasn't confused. He doesn't understand the weight of it." "He doesn't need to," Alessandro said. "He needs to understand that he's supported." The word lingered. Supported. She exhaled slowly. "You could have talked to me first," she said. "Yes." "You didn't." "No." "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because the deadline was 10 a.m. The answer was practical, not emotional. And that, somehow, hurt less. "I won't make decisions about him to hurt you," he added quietly. "I make them to protect him." She believed that. even if it unsettled her. Hidden children are vulnerable, he repeated softly. Acknowledged children are protected. The statement hung in the air between them. Not a threat. Not a boast. A philosophy. Upstairs, Daniel's shadow crossed the window briefly as he paced impatiently, waiting for pizza. Isabella looked up at it, then back at Alessandro. This isn't your world taking him, she said slowly. No, he replied. It's me standing beside him. The difference mattered, and for the first time since the announcement, her anger softened into something more complicated. Not agreement, understanding. She opened the car door. Let's get pizza, she said quietly. Alessandro nodded once, and as they walked toward the building together, she realized something she hadn't expected. He hadn't exposed their son. He had positioned him, and in his world, position was protection. The awards were announced just before dismissal. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly, children seated cross-legged on the floor while parents filled the folding chairs behind them. Daniel sat in the second row, hands resting on his knees, trying very hard not to look like he cared too much. Isabella watched him from a few rows back. Alessandro stood beside her, arms relaxed at his sides, expression unreadable. The principal stepped to the microphone again, smiling warmly. We've seen extraordinary creativity this year, she began. Every participant should be proud. Daniel's shoulders lifted slightly at the word proud. Category winners were announced first. Applause echoed through the room as children ran up to receive ribbons and certificates. Daniel clapped for each one, even when his name wasn't called. Isabella felt the tension coil inside her chest anyway. She told herself it didn't matter. He had presented. He had stood tall. He had been seen. And now, the principal continued, we'd like to recognize several students for honorable mention. Projects that demonstrated exceptional effort and clarity. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his jeans. Daniel Marino, for chemical reactions, the power of volcanoes. For half a second, he didn't move. Then Isabella leaned forward. That's you, she whispered. His head snapped up. Me? He mouthed. Yes. He stood slowly, then faster, walking toward the stage as applause filled the room. Not thunderous, not dramatic, but steady. Warm. Alessandro didn't clap louder than anyone else. He didn't draw attention. He simply watched. And in that watching, Isabella saw something that hadn't been there before. Not calculation, not strategy, pride. Daniel accepted the ribbon with careful hands, glancing once toward them in the crowd. He found them immediately. Both of them. And his grin spread wide and unguarded. As he returned to his seat, the boy beside him whispered something excitedly. Daniel nodded, ribbon clutched tightly in his hand. The ceremony concluded with more applause, children scattering back toward their tables to collect projects. Daniel ran toward them as soon as he was released. I got honorable mention, he shouted breathlessly. You did, Isabella said, kneeling to hug him. Alessandro crouched beside them. Well earned, he said calmly. Daniel held up the ribbon. It's not first place, he admitted. No, Alessandro agreed. Daniel waited. But it means they noticed your preparation, he added. That matters. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Next year, he said confidently. I'll win. Alessandro's mouth curved slightly. I don't doubt it. As the auditorium emptied, parents approached briefly, congratulating Daniel, nodding respectfully toward Alessandro. No whispers now. No uncertainty. Just acknowledgement. Outside, the sleek black car waited at the curb once more. But it no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt expected. Daniel skipped ahead, ribbon waving in his hand. I'm going to hang this above my desk, he declared. You should, Isabella said softly. They walked toward the parking lot together, Daniel between them this time, not trailing behind. His shoulders were squared, his steps confident. Not because he had won first place, but because he had been seen and supported. Isabella slowed slightly as they reached the car. She looked at Alessandro. "It wasn't about the money," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "No. It was about responsibility." "Yes." She glanced toward Daniel, who was carefully placing the volcano into the back seat. "You wanted them to know," she continued, "that he's not alone." "I wanted them to know he's mine," Alessandro replied evenly. The words weren't possessive. They were protective. "And that anyone who underestimates him," he added softly, "underestimates me." She felt the truth of that settle deep. The check hadn't been charity. It had been declaration. Not dominance over a school hallway, but alignment beside a child. Daniel slammed the car door closed and leaned into the front window. "Are we celebrating?" he asked eagerly. "Yes," Isabella and Alessandro answered at the same time. Daniel laughed. As they drove away from the school, Isabella watched the building shrink in the rearview mirror. She thought about the deadline, about the black car at the curb, about the whispers in the hallway, and about Daniel standing on that stage, ribbon in hand, eyes bright with something that wasn't fear. It was pride. Not pride in power, pride in effort. Pride in being acknowledged. She had spent years believing safety meant shrinking their world, keeping it small, quiet, unnoticed. But today, walking out of that school between them, Daniel hadn't looked burdened by a powerful surname. He had looked supported by it. And Isabella understood something with sudden clarity. The check hadn't just funded a science program. It had claimed responsibility. It had drawn a line. And it had ensured that no one, not a deadline, not a whisper, not a system, would ever quietly underestimate her son again. Not out of fear, out of pride.